Welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. This time, some thoughts on Hel. Hel, daughter of Loki and the Jotun or giant woman Angerboda, and ruler of the realm of the dead that bears her name in Niflheim, is a most interesting goddess. Now, she's frequently misrepresented and seldom properly understood. One I have spoken about at length previously, and I think worthy of a bit of an update, the addition of a few extra thoughts. While generally relegated to a minor position in the Old Norse pantheon, Hel should actually be seen as a major goddess, in my opinion, in that she influences everyone in the human realm, Midgard, more directly than any of the other gods. And why is that? Well, it's a matter of simple logic. Because everyone dies. Yes, everyone dies. Therefore, everyone, both high-born nobility and low-born peasant, king, jarl, or thrall, will enter her realm. Now, how many could ever hope to come face-to-face with Odin, Freyr, or Tyr? You know, they won't get an apple from Idun. Thor isn't going to let them swing his hammer. No, not that they could, of course. But all will meet Hel. She is perhaps in that sense the most important of all the gods, and was, I'm sure, greatly venerated and acknowledged in the Viking Age, and probably long before that, which I'll have more to say about later. I mean, after all, this woman was going to be your boss, your caretaker, if you like, forever. So, worshipping her, telling her, how much you thought of her, how nice she was, how you respected her, that would probably be seen as, well, a sensible thing to do. You were going to be with her for a rather long time. As I said, she is both misrepresented and misunderstood as far as her popular image is concerned. She is seen as evil, cruel, and uncaring, a death goddess, a goddess of misery, presiding over a dismal and joyous realm of everlasting gloom and despondency. She is usually depicted as a half-rotting corpse, a monstrous creature straight out of a horror movie. Yet, in fact, she is none of those things. For one thing, she is not a goddess of death. In fact, she really has nothing whatever to do with death. Ah, but you say, does she not rule the realm of the dead in Niflheim? The realm itself, also known as Hel? Yes, she does, and that is exactly my point. The dead, not death. She rules the realm of the dead. She is the custodian of the dead, appointed to that position by Odin himself. But she never kills anyone. She has no say in when, where, or how anyone dies. She does not cause death. She does not bring death. In fact, you could say that it is death itself that brings her to take those who die to her realm. She is goddess of the dead, not goddess of death. There's a subtle difference between the two. She has no more to do with death than, say, does an undertaker. I mean, an undertaker hasn't caused a person's death, but he or she has a responsibility for that person afterwards. Another analogy would be a prison governor. Now, a prison governor has nothing to do with the commission of crime as such. They simply house and take care of those who have committed it. When Odin sends her to Niflheim, his instructions to her are to receive the dead and to take care of them. He says nothing at all about devising various ways of making them bloody miserable while she's at it, nor about going out and killing a few herself to make up the numbers on a slow day. Her role is custodial, nothing more. Just as she is misrepresented, so too is her realm. It did not lie underground in some dark and dismal cavern. Well, not as such, anyway, though part of it may have been underground. But it is described as being at least partly visible from other locations. And indeed, if it were a subterranean location, it would hardly need a wall around it, would it? The sun is mentioned as shining there, which would not be possible if it were below ground. And there is even a mention of a farm on the road to Hel. There are meadows filled with flowers mentioned in one tale, and warriors fighting as they would in Valhall. It could be easily reached, even by the living, if they had sufficient reason to do so, by simply going along the Helvegar, the Hell Road, and telling the guardian of a bridge why you wanted to enter. Now, not many people ever actually did that, of course. It wasn't a popular tourist spot by a very long way, but it could be done if you had sufficient reason to do it. There are references in the Poetic Edda that suggest it is below ground, and there is some confusion between various tales, but by and large the image we get is of a place not unlike the realm of the living, some of which at least is not buried down in the ground, or it could not be seen. But back to Hel herself. She was depicted in one of those awful, oh so awful, Thor movies as sprouting huge antlers like a stag from time to time while wearing a black leather catsuit. Which was so painful to watch. But it's not just the Thor movies that get her wrong, and I suppose since they got everything else wrong as well, we could hardly expect them to get her right. In fact, almost every artistic depiction of her in books or in many documentaries is completely wrong, where she is portrayed as half alive and half dead, with one side of her body nothing but bones, or with rotting flesh hanging off her, or maggots dripping out of her nose, sometimes her face normal on one side and a skull on the other. She is often shown as half normal flesh colour and half blue, divided neatly down the middle of her face, and even depicted as an old hag. Now, where did the idea of an old hag come from? That concept does exist in Irish mythology, where there is an old woman figure, a hag known as the Halia, though she has nothing to do with ruling over the dead. I've seen Hel referred to as hunchbacked and deformed, making her into some sort of demonic entity out of a bad nightmare, yet without the slightest historical justification for any of that. That portrayal of her existing entirely in the imagination of those who created it. There is nothing anywhere in either the collected poems in the Poetic Edda nor the works of Saxo Grammaticus that gives even the slightest suggestion of any of those things. There is a mention of her being partly normal flesh colour and partly blue in the Prose Edda, written in Iceland during the 13th century by Snorri Sturluson, who lived from 1179 to 1241. But that is all, and one assumes Snorri was referring to the bluish tint frequently seen in dead bodies. But he says nothing about how that colouring was distributed. Was it all over? Was it patchy? Was it half and half? There is no mention by him of deformity, rotting flesh, or anything else of that nature. He does not mention any of those things. He only mentions that unusual colouring. And from that one mention of an unusual colouring has come all the lurid and often gruesome artistic representations of Hel as a living nightmare, you might say, a walking, half-rotting corpse. All that from a mention of a blue tint. But Snorri's mention of the blue colour is in itself a bit questionable because of his Christianization of the Old Norse stories. And it is not mentioned anywhere else by anybody else. There are plenty of mentions of other outstanding aspects of the Norse gods in the various sagas and poems. Thor's hammer, Idun's apples, Freya's golden necklace, Odin's missing eye, and so on. But only that one reference to Hel's colour. Now, a very outstanding feature in itself that nobody else mentions, which is odd to say the least. Were she a very strange colour, and most definitely if she were a partly rotting corpse or a deformed, hunchbacked old hag, somebody else would have mentioned it, and they didn't. Even Snorri makes no mention of any of the gruesome things so often depicted in modern images of Hel. He paints her as a gloomy, miserable bitch, perhaps, though he greatly contradicts himself elsewhere, even in that. But he doesn't depict her as something akin to Medusa with her snake hairdo. But now, here's a very good question. Why? Why would Hel look dead? Why would she have part of her body rotting away? Why, for that matter, would she even have a bluish tint to her skin? Hel is not dead. No, Hel isn't dead. That is a very important thing to bear in mind. Those who reside in her realm, those who she takes care of and is responsible for, they are dead. Yes, they might look a bit bluish, but Hel herself is very much alive, so why would she look like a corpse? Does an undertaker resemble a dead body because he or she works with the dead? No, of course not, nor would Hel. She was not born dead. She didn't pop out of the Jotun Angerboda's womb as a half-rotting corpse. And it would be very unlikely that she would later adopt a corpse-like appearance just to blend in, you might say, with those in her realm. Not that the residents of Hel were corpse-like themselves, they would have looked much as they had done in life. The Norse realm of hell being pretty much a continuation of life. People were eating and drinking, fighting, having sex, and so on, as they had done in life. You know, they were not rotting corpses. So why would hell herself take on that form? Far from blending in with the locals, you might say, she would have stood out like a searchlight in a dark room. She would have been the only one there who looked like that. I think we must simply lay that at the feet of Snorri Sturluson. There is another mention of what seems to be the blue colour by Snorri, again, when Hermode is sent by Odin to see if Hel will allow Balder to return to Åsgardr. And he travels the Helvegar and is stopped by the guardian of the bridge on that road. She asks why he wishes to enter the realm of the dead, since he is clearly not dead, not being the colour of a corpse. Now, there is no mention anywhere else of any special colour for residents of hell, even by Snorri himself. Not the companies of warriors fighting as they would in Valhall, mentioned by Saxo, nor Balder and his wife, or anyone else. So that seems to be a Snorri touch, but one that he didn't apply to everyone. You know, he was very selective in that, which does tend to make it very, very questionable. You know, if one person was going to look blue, well, then why didn't everyone look blue? There are two outstanding artistic depictions of hell that show her as she should be seen, not how she is usually and incorrectly seen. The first is a drawing by Johannes Geertz, made in 1889, and it shows Hel with her hound Garma, who, since he was often said to be chained, is sometimes seen as actually being Fenrir. And Geertz depicts her as a very powerful looking woman, a woman who, in today's terms, probably would have been working out. And then there is a very nice painting by Emil Doppler called Loki's Gesucht, or Loki's Brood. And that shows Angerboda sitting in a cave as a very attractive young Hel sits outside with her brothers Fenrir and Jormungandr. Both are in the public domain. This is the way one should really think about hell, in my humble opinion. Snorri, of course, wanted to preserve the old tales, to keep the spirit of Norse poetry alive and pass it on. But he lived in Christian times, 200 years after the conversion of Iceland, and that is reflected very strongly in his retelling of the sagas and poems in his prose Edda. I suppose he couldn't be seen to give the impression that old pagan stories were correct, that the worship of these gods was right, or that they were good. You know, the church would take a very dim view of that, so he couldn't stress the good side of it too strongly. Nor, of course, do we know if he was actually a secret believer in the old ways, or he was merely sympathetic to the poetic style of those times and wanted to preserve it. But either way, he adapted many of the old tales to a more Christian viewpoint. Of course, that could have had nothing to do with any fear he might have of the church. It may simply have been his own desire to make them acceptable to as wide an audience as possible, and Christianizing them would, of course, help in that regard. But it was clearly a deliberate choice on his part. The concept of hell as a place of doom and gloom, of everlasting misery, for example, and hell herself as an evil, demonic creature, neither concept having existed in Old Norse belief, but that would be acceptable to Christians, who saw their hell as a place of everlasting fire and brimstone, presided over by Satan, his role to eternally punish those in his, well, care would be the wrong word, in his realm. Snorri painted the realm of hell as a gloomy, dark, and dismal place, whereas it had been seen by the Norse as green, with flowers growing in it, described by Saxo as much like Midgard in springtime. And Snorri portrayed Hel herself as something more akin to the Wicked Witch of Sleeping Beauty, only a great deal worse. And his attempts to demonize her, they're often quite laughable. They are so wildly exaggerated. It's like he got them from some exceptionally bad 1950s horror movie, such as having her eating from a dish called hunger, using a knife called famine, sleeping in a bed named illness. The threshold of her dwelling was called stumbling block, and her curtains were named bleak misfortune. Who names their curtains? You know, there is nothing about that anywhere else, and Snorri certainly put a lot of effort into making Hel, well, less than likable. He even gives her two servants, called Lazy and Slow, and so slow were they, in fact, that no one could actually see them move. You sort of looked at them, you looked away for a few minutes, looked back again, oh, they moved. Yes, well, you wouldn't really want to be waiting for a hot meal with them bringing it from the kitchen, unless, of course, you fancied a plate of assorted mould by the time you got it. But, Snorri isn't consistent, as though he altered some things, but he didn't alter others. The doom and gloom aspects I've just mentioned contrast sharply with his own description of the benches strewn with extra rushes to make them comfortable for Balder and his wife, a banquet held in their honour, gold rings decorating the hall, and special mead brewed to welcome the new arrivals to Hel. Balder given the seat of honour beside Hel herself on the dais, which portrays her as quite a welcoming goddess. I mean, would the gloomy, half-rotten hag wallowing in misery and despair suddenly transform into hostess of the year, throwing on a jolly little party for a guest? Yeah, that's seem a bit unlikely. And, Hel's providing food would seem to be, well, purely for pleasure rather than necessity, since the dead hardly require food as nourishment. You can't really starve to death if, well, you're already dead. Much like the warriors feasting in Valhall, I suppose. I mean, they don't really require all that roast boar and mead to stay alive, since they aren't. Of course, I suppose there could be an argument there that the spirits of the dead require spiritual food to remain alive in a dead sense. Yeah, that's just getting a bit too complicated, I think, so we'll pass on that one. There also seems no restriction on people's movements in Hel, since Balder, who doesn't seem to be particularly upset or miserable at being in Hel, he certainly doesn't regale Hermodr with agonizing stories of his sufferings, and he's allowed to walk Hermodr to the gate when he leaves, and to give him gifts to bring back to Osgard. His wife Nanna also giving Hermodr gifts to take back, a linen robe for Frigg and a finger ring for Fulla, which again hardly fits Snorri's demonization of both the realm of Hel and of Hel herself. Where did Balder and Nanna get those things? I mean, was there a gift shop in Hel? That in itself suggests a degree of normality in the realm of Hel, that such things were actually available. You certainly wouldn't have done very well looking for a linen robe in the fires of the Christian Hel, perhaps an asbestos one, but definitely not linen. There are times such as this when Snorri seems to let his Christian guard down, so to speak, rather contradicting himself or other accounts. Obviously, Snorri is simply retelling the old stories handed down by word of mouth from previous centuries, altering them to some extent to fit his own Christian age, but often leaving other aspects intact, as in the case of Balder. He is very inconsistent. There is a debate about the name of Hel. Was that always the name used by the Old Norse to describe the ruler of the realm of the dead, or was it a later adaptation of the Christian term Hel, spelt with two L's? Well, it wasn't borrowed from the Christians. We can be certain of that one, since the word Hel is found nowhere in the Bible, either in the Old or the New Testament, though there are various names used to describe the place where the dead went, plenty of them, but Hel is not one of them. And in later centuries, the later versions of the Bible, the words that are of genuine biblical origin, such as Sheol, Gehenna, or Hades, well, they were translated as Hel, a word that exists nowhere in the original text. So it seems it was actually the Christians who borrowed the Norse word Hel and added an extra L. I've mentioned at the start that Hel's place in the Norse pantheon is usually regarded as quite minor. You won't find her sort of listed right up with the top gods, but I feel that is wrong. I'm quite sure that worship of her would have been very important in the Viking Age and previously. After all, everyone was going to meet her at some stage. Everyone would either dwell in or at least pass through her realm. So telling her how much one regarded her would seem a sensible thing to do, keeping in with the boss. As I said, meeting Thor or Tyr was unlikely. Certainly Odin wouldn't be the one that the average Joe Soap was going to be chatting to. He wasn't going to let you throw his spear, Gungnir, or give you a ride on his horse Sleipnir. Nor would Freya let you try on her golden necklace. But you would meet Hel. Everyone would meet Hel. And they would get the full range of her services, whatever those may be. That in itself, to me, placed her high up in the Norse pantheon. In my opinion at least, and I'm quite sure that devotion to her would have been seen as important. She might well have been invoked by those who were sick or dying, people imploring her to come sooner, people in great pain near the end of their lives would have seen her as a most welcome goddess, going to her realm bringing an end to their sufferings. She would have been welcomed by those in pain. So there we leave the goddess Hel, whether you see her as a deformed, demonic old hag with the flesh dripping off her bones and maggots falling from her nose, lurking in a subterranean cavern of utter misery, or you see her as a more or less normal woman who could actually welcome you to her far from dismal realm with a feast in her hall, if you were a celebrity, of course, obviously. If you were a nobody, well, you were probably just going to be met by a thrall of some kind at the reception desk who would tell you where your room was. So, until next time, I shall say farewell, goodbye, for now.